Hello everybody! In this video I'm going to show you some of the graphing features of the calculators that you use in class. So we're going to specifically be addressing graphs of equations. We'll talk about graphs of data later on when we actually have data to graph. Let's start off with the graphing buttons. Alright, so the graphing buttons are all along the top row here. The first one, y equals, is what you use to input equations. Window is what allows you to adjust the windows. So if you have, if you want your x-axis to go from -5 to 5, then you would change it here. Zoom is, well, zoom. Trace will allow you to have a little cursor travel along your graph. And the graph button is, well, to graph. Now, if you just press graph, you may or may not have something in there. It just gives you the axes, and so this is what your axis is going to look like. And the one thing you have to remember is that your x-axis is longer than your y-axis because we have a little rectangular screen, which means a lot of the graphs, unless you change the window, are going to be stretched horizontally. So to see a graph, you need to type an equation in. So you type y equals, and you get this menu here. And this is how you enter equations. So the place to enter equations is with a button that looks like y equals. And you type in whatever you want. If you just type in numbers without variables, you're just going to get horizontal lines. So to get the variety of graphs, you have to press the X button. And it has more than just an X on it. You see there's a green alpha key and then an X, comma, T, comma, 0 with a line through it, comma, N. And this is the variable button. So if you just press this, you get an X, and you see how that little equal sign got highlighted? That means that the graphing calculator will graph that highlighted line, and if you press graph, then you get the graph of the equation y equals x. And your windows, as I said, is a skinny little rectangle. So if you want to change that, there's a way which I'll show you in a second. So to graph, you press the button that literally says graph. Now on to more than one equation. So if you wanted to graph multiple equations to compare the way they looked, you just use your down cursor to go down to the next equation, and you can type in another equation. I'm going to type in -x. And remember, the negative, you have to press that button for negative. And if I graph this, well, you'll notice first that those are both highlighted, right? And if you press graph, you'll get both equations. Okay, and if you press trace, a little cursor shows up, and this tells you what equation you're on. So this tells you that you're going to trace the equation y1 equals x, and this tells you the point that the cursor's on. And if you just use your arrow keys, you'll notice that these x values change and there's this little x that shows up, and that's where you are. So you can trace along and find special points on the graph. If you want to switch from one equation to the other, you use the up or down arrow key, and you see how that changed to y2, so it just swapped to the other equation. Now let's say you have even more stuff on here, like 3x and 0.5x, but you don't want to graph all four of these at once. You just want to compare them two at a time. So let's say I don't want to see -x. You see how I use the arrows to move my cursor so it's over the equal sign? If I press enter and I move away, you'll notice that it's no longer highlighted. What that means is the calculator will not graph that equation if the equal is not highlighted. So I can go and I want to graph y equals x and y equals 3x, and those are the only two lines you're going to see. So if you use your arrow keys to trace, press trace and use arrow, I'm on y1 now, scooch over a bit using the left arrow, and then up to the second equation only on y3. So it doesn't show all of them, it just shows the ones that are highlighted. And so that's how you deal with multiple equations. Now let's talk about window. So if I press the window, you'll see these options: Xmin, Xmax, XSEL. This is all about the x-axis. The minimum is the number on the far left. The max is the number on the far right. And the SCL stands for scale. So I have a window that goes from -10 to 10 with a scale of 1. And similarly, I have values for the y. I have the minimum y value, -10, minimum or maximum y value 10, y scale 10. So that means this value up here is going to be 10, that value there is going to be -10, and it's going to count by ones. So if you want to manually change your window, say to only show the first quadrant, then you would do it in this option here. Remember, it's under window. And just put your cursor over the thing you want to change and type in the number you want it to be. So if I only want to be first quadrant, then I can change these values, and when I graph it, it's going to only graph the first quadrant. Now, word of warning, make sure that you use the negative symbol, not the subtraction, and make sure that your minimum value is always smaller than your maximum value, because you'll get errors if you don't do those things. So when I graph, I will get both equations, but only in the first quadrant. And once again, I can press trace, and I can use the up and down arrows to switch between equations and left and right to travel along the equations. And finally, let's talk about zoom. So let's say you've messed with your window, or someone else has messed with your window, and you want to put it back to normal very quickly. You press zoom because you have all these options for zoom. It's not just zooming in and zooming out. Okay, so if I want to zoom in on a graph, I can. And it doesn't do anything at first, because what the calculator wants you to do is it wants you to center the zoom. And so if you move your cursor around, you see this little bitty dot. Well, that little dot is going to be the center of your zoom. So as soon as I choose my center and press enter, it's going to zoom in on that part of the graph. And zoom out works a similar way. If I want to zoom out, I choose 3, little cursor, press enter, and that's going to be the center of my zooming out, right? But my windows are all messed up. I want them to be back to normal. And that's what zoom standard is for. So if I press zoom 6, what's going to happen is my window's automatically going to change to the default -10 to 10, -10 to 10. And you might have noticed another zoom, zoom square. Now zoom square is super important if you have to compare angles on lines. So let's say if you want to know 2 lines are perpendicular or intersect at a right angle, you can't tell by the graph from its standard window. You have to zoom square it. And all that does is it makes sure that the scale on the x-axis is exactly the same as the scale on the y-axis. So if I go to my window, I'll see this now. X goes from -15 to 15, and the y goes from -10 to 10-ish. And so that's how I can square for angle comparisons.